Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. My name is Andrea Castillo. I'm an adult services librarian at Beatley Central Library in Alexandria, Virginia. And so welcome to everyone from all of the places that you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's program, Asian American Entertainment in the Exclusion Era. Our program is presented by Eric Hung and Nancy Yunhwa Rao of the Music of Asian America Research Center, or MARC, founded in 2017, which strives to collect, promote, and teach music created by Asian Americans. For today's program, they'll be discussing music from the time between 1875 and 1943, when federal, state, and municipal governments severely restricted immigration from Asia and barred many Asians from citizenship, land ownership, and numerous occupations. The result is the development of largely bachelor ethnic enclaves. This program, co-sponsored by the 1882 Foundation, explores how Asian Americans of this period entertain themselves and what the shows they produced say about their efforts to assimilate, preserve heritage cultures, and form new Asian American hybrids. Before we get started with the program and introductions of our speakers, I just want to lay out a few ground rules. First, we are recording this program. It should only capture the speakers and whatever presentations or videos they share on the screen. Chat messages to the host or to the group will be saved separately from the video. If you're concerned about the image of you being shared, I would advise you to turn off your camera. And as you see, we've muted everyone as they enter the room. So please keep yourselves muted during the presentation and when the panelists are speaking. We welcome your questions in the chat, and there will be points in the program today where we will welcome discussion. Please be respectful of our speakers and other attendees. We want to have a rich discussion today, but those who do not follow the rules will be removed from the program. All right, and now for our speakers. Eric Hung, the Executive Director and co-founder of MARC. Eric is a musicologist with extensive experience in nonprofit management and an adjunct lecturer in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. His academic research focuses on Asian American music and public musicology. Current projects include a book on trauma and cultural trauma in Asian American music and an edited volume on public musicology. His pedagogical project, incorporating local musics in the undergraduate music history curriculum, won the teaching award from the American Musicological Society. Eric is also an active pianist and conductor who has performed in Germany, Austria, Hong Kong, and Australia, and throughout North America. Prior to joining the nonprofit world full-time, he was a tenured professor at Westminster Choir College of Rider University. He has also served as executive director and interim president of New York-based Gamelan Dharma Swara and co-director of the Westminster Chinese Music Ensemble. Nancy Yunhwa Rao is the president of MARC. She is a professor of music theory at Mason Gross College of the Arts at Rutgers University. A specialist in American music, her work is multifaceted, bridging musicology, music theory, and scholarship on Chinese opera with gender and ethnic studies. Her work highlights the much neglected musical history of Chinese in the United States, Canada, and Cuba. Her research has led to writings on transnational issues in the production and opera performance in these Chinatown theaters. She has mined immigration files for this research. Publications in this area can be found in Cambridge Opera Journal, Journal of the Society for American Music, Journal of 19th Century Music Review, as well as in several collections of essays. Her book, Chinatown Opera Theater in North America, includes analysis of playbills, performing networks, opera arias, stage spectacles, and more. The book has recently received in the Music in American Culture Award from the American Musicological Society and the Certificate of Merit for Best Historical Research in Recorded Country, Folk, Roots, or World Music from the Association for Recorded Sound Collections. As a music theorist, Rao has explored intersections between China and the West, in particular, global perspectives in contemporary Chinese music. She has published on the use of music gestures, vocal style, and percussion patterns of Beijing opera and contemporary music, by composers of Chinese origin. Her study on the American composer Ruth Crawford won her a National Award of Best Article in American Music, published in 2007 from the Society for American Music. Her interview on Crawford's imprint on contemporary music is published in Women in Art Music. She has continued in the direction of sketch studies, for which her publication can be found in Music Theory Spectrum, as well as Carter Studies Online. And now for Eric and Nancy.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's so nice to see so many people here. It's really nice to see faces I know. Some faces I know, but somehow has a new name, Sharon, Graffiti. And also it's really nice to see people I don't know, and I look forward to meeting you at some point. So let me share my screen. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon. I want to thank Andrea Castile and the Alexandria Library for inviting Dr. Rao and me to give this presentation and for putting such an emphasis on Asian American issues in their recent programming. I also want to thank Ted Gong and the 1882 Foundation for co-sponsoring this event. Today, we'll be talking about the United States' very first immigration laws. Before 1875, our country had no immigration laws. We had open borders. Anyone could cross them and settle. The first immigration laws were implicitly and then explicitly designed to limit people coming from China. Because of this, Chinese people became the first undocumented immigrants in the country. And some of the loudest voices against exclusion came from African Americans. And the loudest voice was Frederick Douglass, who in 1869 said, quote, "There are such things in the world as human rights. They rest upon no conventional foundation, but are external, universal, and indestructible. Among these is the right of locomotion, the right of migration, the right which belongs to no particular race, but belongs alike to all and all alike. It is the right you assert by staying here, and your fathers asserted by coming here. It is this great right that I assert for the Chinese and Japanese, and for all other varieties of men equally with yourselves now and forever. I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity. And when there is a supposed conflict between human and national rights, it is safe to go to the side of humanity," end quote. In this time of national reckoning, I think it is important for us to recognize and to acknowledge the advocacy that African Americans have done on behalf of Asians and Asian Americans on exclusion, the Japanese incarceration, the acceptance of refugees after the Vietnam War, and on many other occasions. Black Lives Matter. Now, let us watch an excerpt of a music video from the 1940s. As you watch the video, please post your reaction in the chat. Did you like it? Did anything surprise you? What do you think was the occasion for the video? What information can you glean from the setting? Why do you think the sisters went to that particular table in this particular clip? You'll understand what I mean very shortly.
The Kim Blue Sisters.
It's the very same old story. Boy meets girl at first glance, there's romance. She looks into his eyes and softly she sighs. Take me, honey, won't you? Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I never get back. Let me root, root, root for the whole team. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game.
Okay, so the full video is about 3 minutes long. I'll give you 30 seconds or a minute to see what reactions you have. Andrea, how do I actually see the chat when I'm sharing the screen?
At the bottom of the screen, you have, if you just put your mouse over it, and you can click chat and it will show up. I don't see anyone actually have input, so.
It's at the top.
Let's see. I don't know if in the view options.
Yeah, I saw it came with a different window.
Okay.
Okay, so there are a few observations. And feel free to write to everybody, not just me. So some of the observations are, they're trying to appeal to a white audience. They sang an all-American song, table with Asian American men serving in the US military. US soldiers at the table, baseball, want to be American, but the sisters have no accent. They are American. Notice all Chinese men. Okay. Oh, sorry, you can't write to everyone apparently. Okay.
All right. No, hold on. I'm gonna see. Seeing if I can change the settings.
Okay.
I think I just did. Does someone want to try a message now? I can also read out the messages I received. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone.
Okay. One more comment I've seen so far. I would love to play the audio for students and have them guess the race of the singers. This is a great example of the independence of race and voice, right? Okay. So yeah, so those are some of the key.
Oh, shall I read you some of the ones I received, or? I'm
sorry, I didn't hear you.
I received a few while it was still in private mode.
Okay.
That I can share. One person says, sounds like 1940s music, looks different though. The singers went to the table where the Asians were sitting. It seems to be the type of patriotic entertainment that was common during the 40s, almost as if the intent was to Americanize Asians. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then everything else is to the full audience.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so so some of the key points, of course, they're singing as American a song as possible, right? They sing at what looks like a Chinese restaurant. We'll talk about something that might be related to the setting in a little bit, but just be aware that the setting is somewhat Chinese looking, or quite Chinese looking, although the crowd is racially mixed and perhaps mostly white. The sisters went over to the table with the Asian soldiers or Asian looking soldiers. I don't know if this is an attempt to recruit Asians or whether they're trying to avoid criticism of race mixing. Their hair is in a victory roll, which is a very common hairstyle during the war. Their cocktail dresses, I don't quite know what they are. They're certainly hybrid. I asked several people how to describe them, and nobody had the exact word for it. But they seem to be also inspired by maybe a Chinese cheongsam. Yeah, so those are some of the points. So what you saw was a music video that featured the Kim Lu sisters. They are daughters of a Chinese paper son. That is, he evaded the Chinese exclusion laws by falsely claiming to be the son of someone who is legally in the US. And their mother is a Polish refugee. And the Kim Lu sisters, as you heard, was a swing era vocal quartet. And they started performing in the mid-1920s, and they broke up in the mid-1940s. They grew up in Minneapolis and attended the same dance classes as the Andrews sisters. And while they were still touring, they started performing in local revues and soon received invitations from vaudevilles around the country. As their careers took off, they moved to Chicago, which gave them better access to important venues, impresarios, and stars. In 1939, they landed on Broadway, performing in George White's Scandals at the Elvin Theater, which is now the Neil Simon Theater. In the early 1940s, the second youngest sister, Jenny, got married and left the quartet. So what you saw was the three remaining sisters, And they continued to perform as a trio for a few years. And the video you saw was from a USO tour in 1944-45. So what does this video tell us about early 20th century Asian American entertainment? First, it shows that Asian Americans have been a part of the mainstream music industry for a long time, but also that much of this history has been largely forgotten. Second, the video shows that even when they're saying "take me out to the ball game," issues of race and identity are frequently foregrounded when Asian American bodies are involved. This is, again, the Chinese restaurant looking setting, as well as the fact that they go to the table with Asians. Finally, the dearth of Asian Americans in this video suggests that there is often a disconnect between Asian American communities and their most famous performers. Now that we have listened to some music, let us provide some background information about the Exclusion era. And to do this, we need to go back almost 5 centuries. To the best of our knowledge, the first Asians to come to the Americas arrived on Spanish galleon ships that made 1 or 2 round trips a year between Acapulco and Manila between 1565 and 1815. Most of these Asians were seamen. Some of them only stayed temporarily in the Americas, but some settled down because of the poor conditions on the ships and discrimination. Asian crew members not only received a significantly lower salary than European crew members, they also only received half of the food rations. In addition to seamen, these ships also carried a good number of Asian slaves. These include artisans, unskilled laborers, and sex slaves. Finally, there were merchants and servants for Spanish elites. Getting precise statistics is impossible, but scholars estimate that between 40,000 and 100,000 Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, South Asians, and Southeast Asians landed in Acapulco as a part of the galleon trade. Of those who stayed, some married into indigenous families, and in the 1610s, a Japanese community also emerged in Acapulco. Spanish galleon ships sometimes made stops in what is now California. The first such stop occurred in 1587. Commanded by Pedro de Unamuno, this expedition made a 3-day stop in what is now Morro Bay, which is northwest of what is now Santa Barbara. According to the ship's log, the crew had a few encounters with a group of indigenous people who lived in the area. These encounters ended with a skirmish, and one of the crew members became the first Filipino to die in what is now US territory. When New Spain began establishing missions and presidios in Alta California in 1769, a few Filipinos became some of the earliest non-native settlers in the region. When the British began colonizing South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia in the 17th century, Asians also began working on British merchant vessels. As a result, Asians started to land in the 3 major ports of the British colonies: Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Although most of them were only in these cities for short periods of time, we know that there were indentured servants who stayed and ultimately started families in the British colonies. We know that in 1680, a daughter of a South Asian father and an Irish mother was born. Because she was racially classified as a mulatto, she was tragically sold into slavery in Maryland later. In discussing this very old history, my goal was to show that Asians have been in this land that became the United States for 4.5 centuries. Coming in small numbers as servants of imperial power, their presence did not provoke any major backlash. That would, however, change in the 19th century. Large waves of voluntary immigration involve both push and pull factors. Push factors refer to reasons why people want to leave their homelands, and pull factors refer to reasons why people want to move to their destinations. For East and South Asians in the 19th century, the push factors were a combination of imperialist policies and incompetent governments that led to widespread famine, displacement, and internal rebellions. Southeast Asia received the largest number of these emigres, but many also moved to Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and the Americas. Most who came to the Americas were part of the so-called coolie trade, the recruiting of indentured laborers to plantations in the Caribbean and South America. This migration was based on unscrupulous agents' lies about plantation labor and the terms of their contracts. I'm talking about the coolie trade here not because the US was heavily involved in it, but because the coolie became a potent stereotype of Asians in this country. The idea that Asians are cheap, dirty workers who take jobs away from white people became the basis of anti-Asian sentiment in the US from the 1850s through the 1940s. And in many ways, the stereotype persists underneath the model minority myth even today. With the coolie stereotype in mind, we will now discuss the three major waves of Asian immigration between the 1860s and the 1930s. Each wave is dominated by a single ethnicity, which then provokes a major backlash and lots of violence against that group. Afterwards, the federal government bans the immigration of that group. The first wave came from China. It started slowly with the California gold rush in 1849 and really took off in the 1860s and 1870s. Discrimination based on the coolie stereotype began almost immediately. But as Dr. Rao would tell you, Chinese immigrants actively resisted this bigotry from the very beginning.
So 1852 is an important year for the history of Chinese Americans. It is the year that Chinese opera, which I'll talk about later, came to San Francisco. At the same time, at this time, California was very new to America. It had only become part of the United States for 2 years. It was admitted to the Unions as a free state after the famous Compromise of 1850. So I want to bring that out to show that Chinese established their community in San Francisco from the beginning of the history of its being part of the United States. And the community were led by well-educated elite merchants. One of the most famous merchants was a person called Norman Asing. He had come to the United States in the 1820s and become a citizen in Charleston. So in 1852, when California governor proposed restrictions of Chinese immigration, Norman Asing wrote an open letter in newspaper challenging the governor. He wrote, "We would beg to remind you that when your nation was a wilderness and the nation from whom you sprung barbarians, we exercised most of the arts and virtues of civilized life, that we are possessed of a language and literature, and that men skilled in science and the arts are numerous among us." So because of this eloquent letter, today Norman Asing is remembered and celebrated as one of the earliest Chinese American activists.
Unfortunately, Norman Asing's reasoned plea was unable to slow the discrimination or to stop the momentum for exclusion legislations on the municipal, state, or federal levels. On screen, you can see some of the violence that Chinese communities across California faced. I could have listed many more instances of arsons, murders, and mob actions. The first anti-Chinese state legislation was passed soon after the first Chinese arrivals. In 1854, the California Supreme Court ruled that George Hall was not guilty in the murder of Ling Sing because people of Chinese descent had no right to testify against white citizens. Over the next 20 years, the state passed numerous exclusion bills, all of which were found to be unconstitutional because the federal government has sole authority on immigration. As a result, many white Californians started lobbying the federal government. And this ultimately led to the passage of the Page Act in 1875. This bill was the US's first immigration restriction. It forbids the entry of unfree laborers, that is indentured servants. Remember the coolie stereotype, right? This comes back here. And women for, quote, immoral purposes, which in other words means every unmarried woman. This legislation is officially non-race and non-ethnicity specific. However, it was enforced almost exclusively on would-be Chinese immigrants. This bill, along with anti-miscegenation laws, made it very difficult for Chinese immigrants to start families in the US. This is really the beginning of bachelor society in early Chinese history, Chinese American history. Very soon after the passage of the Page Act, it became very clear that the Page Act did not satisfy the anti-Chinese activists. So 7 years later, they passed the Ethnic-Specific Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricts entry of all Chinese laborers. Under this law, diplomats, teachers, students, merchants, and travelers were exempt. But as we shall see, the exemptions got tighter and tighter in the next several decades. With the supply of Chinese laborers drying up, American businesses, particularly large farms, began heavily recruiting Japanese laborers. As you can see on screen, the population of Japanese descent people in the US increased from 148 in 1880 to over 23,000 in 1900. Soon after their arrival, they faced violence and attempts at legal restriction. Largely because the Japanese government was significantly more powerful than the Chinese government. Remember, Japan was an imperialist power after it colonized Taiwan in 1895 and defeated Russia in 1905. Japan was able to negotiate a gentleman's agreement with the US government in 1907. Under this agreement, Japan agreed to not allow new immigration to the US with the exception of family reunification. As a result of this agreement, early Japanese Americans, through the migration of family members and the Japanese government's extensive picture brides program, so the Japanese Americans were able to establish normal family lives in the United States. This agreement did not, however, satisfy anti-Japanese voices in California. Eventually, these voices were able to lobby for and push through the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924, which essentially barred all immigration from Asia until the 1940s and really until the 1960s, with one key exception. This map shows the ever-growing Asian ban from the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries. In 1882, Chinese immigration was banned. This was followed by the semi-banning of Japanese immigration in 1907. In 1917, the Asian barred zone extended to South Asia and parts of Central Asia. Japan and China weren't colored pink because they were part of different agreements and laws. In 1924, Japan, Korea, and China are added to the barred zone. If you look at the bottom right corner of the map, however, you will notice one country with a different color, and that is the Philippines. The US could not include the Philippines in the Asian barred zone because the Philippines was a US colony and it had been since 1898. Although Filipinos were not granted US citizenship, they were US subjects, and as subjects, they were allowed to enter the US mainland. And as a result of this special status, American businesses started recruiting Filipinos after the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1907. As you can see on screen, the population of Filipino descent people in the US jumped from 160 in 1910 to over 45,000 in 1930. Not surprisingly, however, Filipinos faced very similar experiences to those of Chinese and Japanese immigrants. As anti-Filipino sentiments grew, the federal government passed the Philippines Independence Act. The primary reason for this legislation is to establish a 10-year decolonization process, after which the Philippines would become an independent country. An important secondary reason involved reclassifying all Filipinos living in the US as aliens for immigration purposes, and also establishing a quota of 50 immigrants from the Philippines each year. So that is an overview of the exclusion period. And because the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino communities all faced such discrimination and violence, each ended up establishing their own ethnic ghettos. This is partly for safety and partly because of housing and job restrictions. There are some cities, such as San Diego, where Chinese and Filipino communities, and they're both bachelor societies, essentially share the same geographic spaces. But generally they were separate communities. In the remainder of the presentation, we will introduce some of the entertainment that took place in each of these communities. And with each type of entertainment, we hope to explore these two questions. One, why did they enjoy and participate in these types of theatrical productions, music, and dance? And two, What do these activities say about their immigration experience and identity formation? We will begin in Chinatowns and with the most elaborate entertainment in these communities, namely Cantonese opera.
So as I mentioned, in 1852, the first Chinese opera troupe arrived in San Francisco and built the first Chinese theaters in America. Just like most other immigrants of their time, they were other Chinese immigrants of the time, they were Cantonese, so they brought Cantonese opera. These began a long history of Chinese theaters in the United States for the years to come. We have talked about Norman Asine as an activist, which is what he is now remembered by. But he was also well aware of the importance of musical culture, so he was one of the managers of the first Chinese opera troupe in America. On the left, you see his name in the program. The program is for October 18th, 1852, which was advertised in the leading newspaper of San Francisco at the time, where Norman Asine also published his open letter to the governor only 5 months ago. The troupe is called Tong Hu Tong, which is spelled in a gazillion different ways in the newspapers that's syndicated across the country. But in Chinese, we think it's called Hong Fu Tang. It also built its own theaters in San Francisco with material it brought. This is just a little background about the China trade around that time. Because of shortage of material in California, a lot of ships that came from Hong Kong brought building materials, and this is no exception. The troupe also toured and performed in cities of the East Coast, including New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. And on the right is a drawing of a typical Chinese theaters in the 19th century. So at one point in late 19th century, Chinese theaters were so popular that there were 4 of them in San Francisco running concurrently. And even in 1920s, there were 2 Chinese theaters in San Francisco. I say even in 1920s because when I mentioned there are 4 running in San Francisco, it was before Chinese exclusion. So even after the Chinese exclusion and after the big fire and earthquake in San Francisco, in 1920s, there were still 2 very vibrant Chinese theaters in San Francisco, and each seat about 800 people or more. On the left, we see a picture of the interior of Chinese theaters Jackson Street, on Jackson Street in 19th century before the earthquake. And in that, you can see balcony, box seat, dress circle, and so on. The walls were decorated with plaque with calligraphy and also paintings. On the stage, you can see the 2 doors to the backstage, typical of Cantonese opera. On the right of the slide, you can see the Mandarin Theater that was built in 1924. It had elaborate valance, canopy, backdrop paintings. Unlike a traditional stage of Chinese opera, this theater had bright backdrops, lots of them, providing scenes of palace, garden, inner chamber, back garden, and so on and so forth. Great China Theater was built only 1 year after the Mandarin Theater in 1925. They were quite the rivalry at the time. One is more traditional, the other more modern and experimental. These 2 pictures are the pictures of exterior of the Great China Theater from around 1930s. As you can see, the audience were of rather fashionable people. The woman's long coat with fur trim and high heels, for example. In fact, I want this picture to remind you that it was just as easy to find star actresses of Cantonese opera at that time in fur coat or high heels, both on and off stage. They were the idols of the young people in the community. You may wonder whether these theaters still exist. In 2012, 8 years ago, I visited Great China Theater, which has changed names several times and has been repurposed. But as you can see here, the original Cantonese opera stage was still there. On the left, you see the original slant floor and balcony. And you can see in the middle, the original backdrops painted. It is painted on a steel sheet, which is the reason that the color is preserved so well. And the columns on the sides, the trims around, and then the sceneries are all painted, as well as the two traditional doorways that we have talked about. It's there on the right. But a hole, as you can see, is caught in the middle of the backdrop. I guess someone else had a different idea about how to use the stage. This theater is still occasionally used for community performances of Cantonese opera or cinemas or other functions. As for the music of Cantonese opera, I want to first introduce the instruments. These are the instruments used in Cantonese opera of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. They accompany the singing and also play sections of interlude and postlude. Today, many more instruments are added to the ensemble, such as violin, saxophone. But in 1920s, it was a lot simpler. And these were still standard, these were the standard instruments. If you look carefully, you can see on the left, it is the fiddlers, and in the middle top is the dulcimer. And at the bottom, there are quite a few different percussion instruments. You have the drum, you have the cymbals, you have the woodblock, and so on and so forth. On the right hand top is the flute, and the bottom is the moon guitar, the so-called moon guitar. And if you, when you visit historical society or museums of Chinese American or Asian Americans, you look closely, you may find some of these instruments in their display. And I did. In 2012, I visited Oroville, which is 2.5 hours north of San Francisco. It once had a large Chinese population for the mining and even a Chinese theater. I found this drum for Cantonese opera of the 19th and early 20th century in the Oroville Museum. It has a lot of pictures and artifacts from the earlier time, including Chinese processions and so on and so forth. I urge you to visit there if you can. I also find other instruments there which are used for Chinese processions. Here is a sona and a sheng. They are the wind instruments that are quite loud, so probably not used in Cantonese opera. At least I have not seen them. And the next thing I want to introduce that's very important for Cantonese opera theater is the wardrobe. The wardrobe of Cantonese opera in the 19th century and early 20th century were really something. They're remarkable. People at that time went to the extreme in expensive, elaborate materials and the creative designs. Here are some costumes now preserved at the Anthropology Museum of the University of British Columbia. What we have here are warrior armor, shoes, wardrobe trunk. The warrior armor has a tiger head design, and it's made with silk, metallic threads, rabbit fur, brass metal, and glass. And as you can imagine, at a time when electricity was not a norm, and with just the candlelight lighting the whole theater, some of this glass and metal material really makes huge difference in terms of the stage presence. On the right-hand top corner is a 7-star headdress. It's made with cotton, paper, plastic, metal, and peacock feather. You see the bright, beautiful blue And that's made with peacock feather, which gives this kind of vibrant blue. And you can imagine after, nearly 100 years now, they didn't lose any of its charm. And you can see this young warrior wearing exactly the same design and probably, we don't know, the same wardrobe. His name is Big Eye Shen. He was one of the well-regarded male warrior of the 1920s. I hope you can imagine actors, all the actor pictures in this colorful and elaborate costume on Cantonese opera stage in those theaters of that time. It was vibrant and fantastic, and the visual impact is somewhat lost when we look at them in black and white picture, but I hope you keep that in your imagination. Cantonese opera has many, many different role types. Here's a bearded warrior, typically in their 40s or 50s. They're typically brave and skillful, very good in martial arts. So here is our legendary Guan Gong. Let's take a look at the clip. We're very lucky to be able to see this video. This was performed by the actor whose name is Xin Zhu, and he was actually one of the top, much loved actor of 1920s. Okay, so this is next one is a female role type. They are typically members of an aristocrat or well-groomed and well-educated family. On the left is one wearing the period costume of the Ming Dynasty. Her name is Xin Guifei. And middle is the more modern dress of the Republican era of the early 20th century. Her name is Guan Yinlian. You will see her later. She's famous and almost a household name of Chinatown kids growing up in San Francisco from 1930s to 1950s. On the right is also famous in a complicated Ming Dynasty dress. She's probably a princess. Her name is Xue Yingluan. In contrast to warrior types we saw earlier, here is a civic scholar type young man. You can see the fan in his hand instead of, Eric, we need to go to the next slide.
All right.
Okay, so in his hand, you can see the fan, and instead of a sword. So that gives away, and they sing in a very different style from the warrior that we saw before. Okay, we can go to the next. In any case, there were many different role types, and these are all pictures, all these ones you saw, taken by May Studio in San Francisco, one of the earliest photographers. They took thousands of pictures of actors, actresses in opera stages with fancy backdrops. If you have an opportunity, I'd like you to look online for a video, that documentary. It's called The Vanishing Chinatown. It's a wonderful documentary about the May Studio. Okay, the next one is Le Wan Nian troupe. It was one of the earliest troops in the decade of 1920s. In other words, after the earthquake. It started in Vancouver, in fact, and then went down to Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. This picture was actually taken in Vancouver. You can see the back center is a revered actress. It was Guan Yinlian that we just saw earlier. Here, her name also appeared on the backdrop above her in those two circles. You can barely see, but it's there. It shows how much she was, respected and loved by the community. These fantastic wardrobe and stage prop, I would like to remind you, were also sometimes shown outside of theaters because Chinese procession was one of the most common ways that Chinese community present its public self. And in those situations, they typically present their Chinese theaters. And therefore, all these things are just as easily found on the parade for special occasions. So I was very lucky a few years ago to talk to a fan of Cantonese opera who grew up in San Francisco in the 1930s. She was a daughter of a tailor in Chinatown, and she shared with me the scrapbooks she and her sisters put together. They meticulously labeled the opera they saw on each page. They cut off pictures of stars from playbills or newspaper and put together this scrapbook of all their stars that were popular at that time. And I can assure you, they were not alone. I've seen several other scrapbooks like this. In addition to theaters, Chinese Americans also went on to have their own cinema companies and recording labels. To your right is Oriental Record, a recording label created in 1927 by the Great China Theater and some other merchants in Hong Kong. This album was one in the first catalog of 28 titles published in 1927. The singer is Bai Jurong, one of the most famous scholar-type actors in Cantonese opera of that time. To your left is Grandview Cinema, which had a complicated history since it was established in San Francisco, then moved to Hong Kong, and then moved back to San Francisco in late 1940s. The earliest films were all Cantonese opera, and performers, I have seen a report of it, would run back and forth between the shooting scene at the film studio in Chinatown and perform on stage at the Mandarin Theater, which was just a few streets away. This film you saw here, White Powder and the Neon Lights, was a story about Chinese theater in San Francisco themselves, that is. So unfortunately, you have to go to Hong Kong Film Archive or two other places, Los Angeles and Berkeley Film Archive, to see these films. But what I can do here is to play you a clip of song sang by aria sang by Jurong.
有信嘞，草为羽毛边，喺我思邊情啊碎，好比渡也。
Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a few seconds to see whether there's any response and questions.
Anybody? Okay, should we continue with, if I don't hear anything else or see anything else?
Sure.
Oh, Sharon has a question. Sharon Graff has a question. Her question is, were there more male performers than female?
That's a good question. Actually, more female performer than male performers, and there's a long history behind this. But basically, female performers were actually new on the scene for Cantonese opera, which they only started to perform on stage in the 1910s, and in 1920s they become a big the people who the audience really like to see, and they were also really, really good. So they become really popular in United States, and so more of them actually. I saw some picture. How many shows were they a day in San Francisco in 20th century? How much did it cost to attend a show? That's a very good question, actually. We only have limited information about 19th century, but for the Hongfu Town, the first one we saw, when he first arrived, it charged something like $6 a show in 1850. So it was crazy. And then finally, after the opening night, it went down to $2. So because when it was $6, it was still filled, but people thought it was crazy. And when it went down to $2 for the top ticket, it was considered much more normal. And from my understanding, they are show every single day in the 19th century. For the 20th century, we have a lot more information because from the studies that I've done in 1920s, I can see that they perform 365 days a year, and including the Chinese New Year Eve. So it was really lively. And I think the price was also not too bad. It's really funny though, that on the East Coast, there were also theater in New York. They're much more expensive than the theaters, than the tickets in San Francisco. So it was something like $2 for the top ticket and 50 cents for the cheapest. So next question. Were there many opera troupes outside the coast during the periods? Yeah, this is also a very tricky question to answer because at the time, we still don't have enough information to see, but my understanding is that they have music theaters that these troupes come into play, and then they become the staple of the theaters, and then new performer will come to join this, and some of the people in the theater original cast then would go out, form their subgroup to perform in other places. So for example, they would go to still coastal town, but smaller coastal towns, or even Nevada and so on and so forth to perform. So that was very much the case in 19th century, in early 20th century.
Right. And you have also written the fact that they go to Havana and New Orleans and places like that.
Right. So in my book, I talk about how in the 1920s it's a huge network. In fact, in Havana, the performers are just as powerful and vibrant and then popular as it was in San Francisco. So the network goes up to Vancouver, Montreal, and go down to Havana, Peru, and so on and so forth. It's a huge network. Was it safe to travel across country at that time? It was interesting because earlier time in the 19th century, before the railroad, they don't travel across the country. They travel by boat down and then go through the middle part or south part to come up. So that's how it travels. So they travel on boat. So obviously that was safe. And as for later time in the 1920s, I think I don't have document as to how they travel, but I think the railroad probably. I don't know how safe it is, but you make me think of one story I heard. There was one actress with a group that came in Seattle. And at that time, there was a lot of immigration obstacle. They could not enter. And finally, the theater decided to let the immigration office decided to let one person to, enter. And that was an actress who was very famous. And guess what? She refused to travel. She would not travel without companion. So they had to release someone else to travel with her, and that person come back to Seattle. So I guess it was not that safe, but they did travel. Talk a little bit about the performance in public space, outdoor, how it's received. I think it's a really tricky question because, as you probably know, in southern China, in Hong Kong, performances of Cantonese opera was actually outdoor. It's typical to perform outdoor because that's how you, perform it outdoor across from the temple or in a temporary thing, rather than a real theater. So when they're in the United States, actually, I don't have much discussion about how they set up performance outdoor per se. However, I do have a lot of evidences of them participating in a parade. So they either on a car drawn by horses, and they would have some, music and then performance on those, car during the procession, or they perform, I guess, for a family banquet. A huge family association can have a banquet, and they can then come to perform in those. These are the situations outside of theaters that they perform, and I don't know whether they hold like open space performance or not.
I think like in San Francisco, that actually is a very problematic because it's so hilly in Chinatown.
Yes. Yeah, I think it is so. Yeah, so I think if anything, I think they can have reduced number and perform in a very compromised space. So thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about other types of music making or...
Oh, wait, I have another question from the chat. Do you know if there are any Chinese performances in the Caribbean islands since there's a sizable population down there?
I don't know, but I would imagine that still a research that needs to be done because I think one of the things that's really important for Chinese migrants is that they continue the practice of the ritual, offering and beliefs. And very often, when they want to settle in one place, that's what they bring because they want to have, security and have prosperous, future. And when they want that, they have their performance. So that's why the performance in, for example, Havana can also be traced to its earliest time. So I think in the Caribbean, if they were significant enough, then that certainly would be the case. I know for sure Peru has that. Oh, great. Yes. Havana is just wonderful. There's also a documentary called Havana Diva. And it tells this wonderful story about two Cuban women who, none of whom were really Chinese by heritage or very little. They barely speak Cantonese, but they could perform Cantonese opera. Why? Because it was the thing to do, and they learned. And then they did not for years after the war and so on and so forth. And when they're at old age, they got together and they start singing Cantonese opera again. So this is another documentary to watch. It's called Havana Divas. Good?
Okay.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, so Cantonese opera was of course not the only entertainment available in Chinatown. From the mid-1930s through the mid-1960s, Nightclubs that featured Asians performing American popular songs and dances, as well as acrobatics and magic tricks, were major attractions in Chinatowns across North America. On screen, you can see advertisements by 3 of the most prominent nightclubs in San Francisco: the Chinese Sky Room, Club Shanghai, and the Dragon's Lair. There's also a napkin from the Lion's Den. And so if you look at the posters, the fact that these are in English and are full of Orientalist stereotypes show that they are aiming largely at tourists, soldiers, and celebrity audiences. At the top right, you can see a photo of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall talking to Jadin Wong, the star dancer at several clubs in the 1930s and 1940s. We know that other celebrities who visited include Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, Abbott and Costello, Jane Wyman, and Ronald Reagan. That said, these clubs also attracted Chinese audiences, particularly those who were born in the US. Kubla Khan was the club that put on one of the most elaborate cabarets in San Francisco's Chinatown. It is a relatively latecomer. It opened in 1944, and the owner was Ed Pond, who had earlier opened the Dragon's Lair. Kubla Khan set 225 people, just to give you an idea of what the insides of these look like. There's a drawing of the club on the right. The show started with dinner, and the prefix for the dinner is $3. And there were 2 sort of prefix options. You can also order a la carte if you want to, but this is the prefix menu. So the Kubla Khan Deluxe included relishes, egg flour soup, almond chicken, fried prawns, egg foo young, chicken chow mein, steamed rice, Chinese candies, and fortune cake. The other option was the American dinner, which included relishes, soup de jour, chef's salad, sirloin steak, half-fried chicken hotelier, chicken satay chasseur, French lamb chops on toast, and some kind of dessert. The ensuing show, called the All Chinese Review, this is a misnomer because there are also Japanese and Filipino performers. Anyway, but the show had a Latin theme. Pond not only emceed, but also performed in various acts throughout the evening. And they would put on 3 shows a night, and that's fairly common. Usually one at like 8:30, one at 10:30, and like one at midnight or something like that. The most elaborate was the nightclub called Forbidden City. It's run by Charlie Lowe, who made a fortune in real estate and the stock market before he opened Forbidden City. And the club was in operation from 1938 to 1970. Forbidden City and Lowe were the inspiration for the flower drum song Celestial Gardens and its owner, Sammy. So, and here's a clip from Arthur Dong's 1989 documentary, Forbidden City, USA, which gives you an idea of what the club is like.
Forbidden City was a curiosity, it was a novelty, it was exotic, it was well-known, it was universally well-known.
Quite a scandalous place to be going because you had showgirls who were only partly dressed, with skimpy costumes and so on. And so this would be kind of a daring place to go.
Every day's a different kind of fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
it was there.
Every day
like a 3-ring circus every day.
No kidding.
No kidding.
Yeah.
There's something going on.
Always something going on. Wasn't this or that, this or that.
Of course, what we did in the 30s and 40s were shocking to the Chinese community and confusing for the Caucasian people.
They've never seen Oriental do this type of, of singing and dancing. This was something new for everybody, even for ourselves it was new.
No one took us very seriously until the Forbidden City opened its doors. So we said, come on, let's show the world our stuff.
Wait to Paris is us.
Right, So in many ways, I think the Kim Lu sisters video that I showed at the beginning was trying to evoke the atmosphere of these clubs, even though the Kim Lu sisters weren't people who performed at these clubs. Any thoughts or questions about these nightclubs?
I have one from the chat. Were there magicians besides Long Tak Sam?
Sorry, can I say that again?
Were there magicians who performed besides Long Tak Sam?
I don't know, not off the top of my head. I can research that. I think the answer is definitely yes, but I don't know what their names are off the top of my head.
I want to also alert you to a book, a comic book that's created by Long Tak Sam's, I think, a granddaughter, and it was a fabulous, picture book for grown up.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Okay, so let us move to Filipino communities. Not surprisingly, what we find in Filipino communities and experiences are similar to what we find in Chinese American communities. There are activities that continue practices from the homeland. Very often, participants need to make adaptations to fit the circumstances and the materials that are available. There are also activities that are based on American popular culture. And we will begin with the rondola, which is an ensemble of plucked strings instruments that came to the Philippines during Spanish colonization. Traditionally, this ensemble accompanied folk ballads and dances. From oral history interviews, we know that many early Filipino Americans sang songs from the rondola repertory, as well as kunaman, or nostalgic Filipino love songs. They were sung in migrant labor camps throughout farms and canneries in California, Alaska, and beyond. So you can see a picture of Filipinos working in a cannery in Alaska at the top left, and at the bottom, they're Filipino farm workers in Washington State. And when available, the singing of these folk ballads and kunaman was accompanied by guitar, banjo, or whatever other instrument that was available. In those days, this music was simply a part of daily life. It wasn't some special preservationist mindset that had them do this song. This is just music they did because this was life. Since the 1970s, rondolas in the United States have been seen first and foremost as a cultural preservation practice. And now singing is usually not a part of rondola performance, but I don't have a video of or recording of an early sort of rondola gathering. So to give you an idea, here is a recent performance. This is a clip of the Sosa Rondola Ensemble from Toronto, playing Sorong Bangi, which is a folk song from the Bicol region, which is located at the very southern tip of Luzon Island. Partly because Filipino musicians were hired to perform in bands at the poshest hotels and clubs throughout Asia, and partly because the Philippines have an established hybrid culture due to Spanish colonization, a good number of Filipino musicians managed to have careers in mainstream American entertainment industry in the early to mid 20th centuries. The most famous of these are probably drummer Dance Barcelona, who performed in Louis Armstrong's band in the 1950s and 60s, and saxophonist Gabe Baltazar, who is half Filipino and half Japanese. Balthazar's Filipino father actually moved to Hawaii in order to become a professional musician. So his both Gabe and his younger brother followed in their father's footsteps. to become professional jazz musicians. Sometimes Filipino musicians also appear in unexpected ways. In the 1930s, Russian Jewish-American mandolin virtuoso Dave Apollon hired a Filipino rondola that was also very adept at jazz to be his backing band. And this is for his New York-based show, which also toured around the country. Here is a clip of Apollon and his Filipino band in a clip from the 1935 short film, The Wishing Stone. The song is entitled The Tiger Rag.
New York.
I wish you were dead, you rascal, you. Truly, thank you very much. Boys, the next number, I wish.
Another Filipino musical activity that played an important role in the American mainstream is the Philippine Constabulary Band. Because the Philippines was a US colony, the Constabulary Band is a US military band. The band made several US appearances, most notably at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. You can see a photo of them at the bottom. The bottom left is at the World's Fair. And the inauguration of President Taft in Washington, D.C. in 1910. You can see them, many Filipino musicians freezing themselves at inauguration time in D.C. You can see also the program for the inauguration party on the right of the screen. And you can hear the band. This is a recording that was made in 1910 by Edison. Going back to entertainment within Filipino-American communities, we need to discuss taxi dance halls, a type of club that was created only because Filipino-American communities in the early 20th century were primarily bachelor societies. These halls hired female dancers, most of whom were white, but there are also some Latinas and African Americans. And for 10 cents or so, a patron can hire one of them for a dance for 1 to 2 minutes. On the right side of the screen, you can see a staff photo of the Rizal Dance Hall in Seattle in 1933. And you can see the male Filipino musicians and the mostly white female dancers that worked at the club. And these halls also provided employment for Filipino musicians who played American popular music. You can see one of the bands that played at one of these taxi dance halls on the left as well. This is a band from San Diego. To close, let us look very quickly at entertainment at Japanese incarceration centers during World War II. At all the camps, even Tule Lake, and you can see a photo from that camp on screen, there were many performances of American popular music and dance parties. And as many survivors have said, this is one method that they use to show their love of American culture. And what I find interesting about this photo is that it was taken very shortly after the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. You can see that many of the men are wearing zoot suits. I don't know if that means anything. I don't know if they knew about the Zoot Suit riots, but in any case, I do, that does intrigue me in some way. There are, since we're running a bit long, and then there are many resources on jazz in the camps. I will just play one recording right now, and this is a recording from 2010 by Mary Kukuyama Nomura, who was known as the Songbird of Manzanar.
I hate to see that evening sun go down. I hate to see that evening sun go down. 'Cause my baby, he done left this town. If I'm feeling tomorrow like I feel today, if I'm feeling tomorrow like I feel today.
But the point that I want to make is that we should, however, recognize that American popular music wasn't all that was happening at the camp. And in giving this slide, I'm sort of going against some of the literature about generations in Japanese American performance. And I think one of the ironic effects of the camp is that these incarceration camps really promoted the teaching of Japanese traditional arts across generations. So Japanese traditional arts really became not so much just the preserve of the older generation, of the first generation immigrants, but also it was because of the camps, it was because people had nothing else to do, and because the great artists can actually teach, have time to teach these young students that Japanese traditional arts was really passed down in these incarceration camps. And so here is an interview with two people who were involved in the documentary Hidden Legacy that talks about this passing down of traditional arts in the camps.
Here, all of a sudden, there were artists. There were kabuki teachers. There were shakuhachi masters. There were, dance teachers. And also the first time they had a ton of time on their hands. They had no work anymore. They were taken away from their livelihoods and such. And if they didn't have something to do, they would just go crazy. And here was an opportunity for them to learn a little bit more about their cultural heritage. So they lost everything, and doing something cultural kind of was the only thing that they were able to hang on to.
You are a well-known classical dancer in the community. I know because I go to the Obon every year.
Thank you, and you dance very well.
Thank you. Let's show some pictures, though. We have some pictures of you in camp. Now, what are we seeing here, and what are some of the strongest images and memories you have of these times?
Well, I do remember that we would ride those trucks that they had in camp, the open-air ones, and go to different blocks to perform. But the amazing thing was the costumes and the wigs that we had. I would have liked to have asked my mother how we got them, how they created them. And we danced very serious dances, and were fully clothed and costumed properly. So
serious dances because of maybe some of the themes?
No, we had teachers who were quite good, and they didn't treat us as children. So we didn't learn children's dances. We just went straight to the classical dances.
You can probably appreciate more sort of the connection that they must have been feeling to their own culture in a situation where it almost kind of felt, as Shirley was mentioning, they're trying to take it away.
Right, I think that is. And then now, thanks to Shirley, I kind of also see the legacy of what happened from those teachers, because so many of us continued it, and so it was preserved for the next generation and the generation after that. You know?
Okay, so I hope this presentation gave you a good sense of the varieties of Asian American entertainment that existed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Entertainment was really important to early Asian Americans because their lives were difficult. Not only did they have long hours and difficult jobs, but they also experienced a lot of discrimination. And as Charlotte Brooks' recent book, American Exodus, showed, up to 25% of second-generation Chinese Americans in the 1920s and 1930s actually moved back to China because the only path available for them in the US was downward mobility. Additionally, many early Chinese Americans, particularly many early Asian Americans, particularly Chinese and Filipinos, experienced family separation and loneliness. Given this situation, entertainment, whether it is traditional music that came from their homelands, American popular traditions, or some type of hybrid, they provided some levity in their lives, and they also allowed them some space to reflect on their immigration experience as well as identities. Given the time we're now living, I hope that the strategies our predecessors used can give us some inspiration as we continue to fight systemic racism that continues to affect many aspects of our lives. Thank you so much. Nancy, do you have something you want to add at the end? Did we lose Nancy?
Oh, Nancy, I think you're muted.
Oh.
Myself. Yes, I think it really is so good to be thinking about these cross a different kind of artistic endeavor, entertainment value, and also groups. The opening video you show, that particular group started in 1920s, and that was exactly the time that the Mandarin Theater and Great China Theater were built in San Francisco. So none of these really move singularly by itself. They all kind of woven together and shape people in different ways. So I can only say that with all these materials that we shown together, it shows still only some slices of the richness, and not to be one of the reasons that I have pursued my work on Chinese opera theater is because I didn't want it to be just this kind of nostalgia, you know, entertainment that people portray it to be, because I don't think it's just nostalgia. I don't think it's just transplant. Mm-hmm. It is something that the community actively trying to, you know, manage, engage, and, you know, recreate with various different local kind of significance. So I think to be flexible in how we view this, try to take away as much preconceived notion of what these arts represent is really important. And also, yeah, just that.
Yeah, I think, and just to bounce off of that a little bit, yeah, I think one of the things that we show as we study this tradition more and more is that the notion of preservationist musical practice or theatrical practice is really problematic in that not just, but like, even when you're dealing with, like now, when we're looking at various dance theaters, you know, name your ethnicity, there's a lot of innovation going on in these programs. They're not just preservationists, they're living traditions. And I think so often we think of these types of ethnic heritage programs as preservationist programs. I think is actually devaluing a lot of work that the directors and the participants in these programs are actively, they're doing things to adapt what what these traditions are to the circumstances that they're living in. And I think thinking of them as preservationist work is not always helpful when we think of that. And I hear a lot of that, working in this area. So yeah, thoughts, questions, comments? Sharon mentions conservation seems like a better word. Yeah, I think that works. In some ways, I think it's even more innovative than conservation. But, yeah. Any particular videos that particularly spoke to you, or?
And I think another thing that's really interesting to be thinking about is how they love or how they hate something, right? So I remember there's a pattern of the Guan Yingling, the actress that I talk about as the household name. She had a godmother who's a patron who's really, take care of her. And also she performed, so this actress performed in her home. So I managed to trace down the great-grandson of that, woman who was a patron of Guan Yingling. And she said, and when I talked to him about his experience of Guan Yingling, he said he just hates Cantonese opera. The best thing to, about those performances is the closing episode. He loved that. And so I think it just at the same time, you have people who love this music, and there are also people who hate it. So to consider the identity of a Chinese American, Asian American, Japanese American, we must accept that it is not fixed, it's flexible, it can only be characterized in one way or the other, and not the wholesale. And in this Forbidden City film that Arthur Downe made, at the beginning there's also some Cantonese opera performers, and that's actually where those club performers set themselves against. They actively try to work against that kind of concept of what Chinese performers could be. So it really is very complicated, and this only urges us to, develop more of what these meanings and identities can really be constructed, and in what way and at what time, against what backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do we have more questions?
Do you want to tell the story about that, the actress who, how they eventually got the companion to travel?
Oh,
That's a hilarious story.
That's actually a fascinating story because, okay, so here goes the story. So in 1924, the theaters were given permission to bring opera troupe to come in, and it was a very difficult, battle to fight. So by 1925, they were quite established, and in fact, they grew to be very successful. So much to the cheering of those immigrant officers, they're successful and they want to expand. And when they apply for expansion, they were received with a lot of hostility. And so, but these were merchants. They have to keep performers coming so that they have new blood. So even though when they were only applying for expansion, they already shipped and engaged performers to come from China to perform. So by the time that it was totally stopped at the border, they could not be allowed in. The battle was really, really hard to win at that time. So this was July 1925, when a troupe of 26 performers arrived in Seattle, and they were not allowed in. In fact, not only that, the immigration wanted the Chinese theaters to send away more performers before it would even consider allowing this. So they negotiate a lot and hired a high-power lawyer who went into, demand with the immigration officer that immigration as a federal government has no right in terms of control the sizes of a local theater. So they hire a powerful lawyer to come to argue with the government about their practices, which is probably something we are doing today too. But anyhow, that's beside the point. So after a lot of negotiation, high-power performers like this, high-power negotiation like this, finally, immigration officer allowed one quota to be vacant to come in. Oh, actually, I take it back. Finally, the theater sent away enough performers, and then immigration officers say, okay, now you can have one person to come in. So, of course, as you can imagine, the Chinese theaters wanted to keep its audience, fascinated and make money. Remember, there's a rivalry, so they need to win this particular theater, which was Mandarin. So they then, after this huge negotiation, lots of back and forth, they get this one quota. So they pleaded for this one person whose name is Li Zhifang. She's a very famous actress. And so she was allowed in, right? So she was released and was able to come in to play in the theater. And then she would not travel. So further negotiation got started, right? So the theater was really initially very appreciative of this one quota become available, but then now it has to negotiate for a second quota so that this person would travel. And so immigration at that time probably was also kind of, have some legal broker who's trying to broker the deal. So the deal was that they would not release a second quota, but they would allow one performer to be released temporarily to be the companion to this famous actress to travel down to San Francisco, and then she would then go back to Seattle. Why San Francisco? Why Seattle? You would ask. Well, because Angel Island, which was the gate of immigration for San Francisco, was notorious. So it's really hard for people to come in there. So instead of having their performer coming from Angel Island, they have all their performer coming in from Seattle. So that added the extra day. But yeah, so at the end, it was exactly that. This actress, get on the stage several days later, and that companion went back to Seattle, went back to, whatever the holding place, to wait for more quota to be released. And the end of the story, which happened a month later, the Chinese theater won. They get their quota to be doubled, and they were able to have 85 performers rather than 45. And so everybody then was allowed in. So that's a victory of 1925 for Mandarin theaters.
Great. Thank you. Are there other questions, thoughts?
I have one from the chat. Are there any museums or institutions that feature Asian American entertainment or music exhibits? I'll leave that to you all.
There has been. Wing Luke in Seattle has a large collection, and that's a Pan-Asian collection. The Museum of the Chinese in the Americas in New York had a Chinese American music exhibit last year. It's not up anymore, but I think there's a website. I don't know. I haven't looked at the website, but I think there is a website still.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about what your organization does?
Yeah, so our organization is, we try to use music to teach Asian American history and experience. and we do programs like this, and we have virtual StoryCorps. We're planning a series of programs coming up on citizenship, music and citizenship. We're planning programs that, because there are a bunch of anniversaries coming up that we want to mark. One is the Chinese massacre of 1871. Next year is going to be the 150th year. And then in 2023 is going to be a big year that a lot of Asian American organizations is going to mark, and that is the Bhagat Singh Tin Supreme Court decision. Bhagat Singh Tin was a South Asian man who made one of, he basically, he got citizenship because of military service, and then it was taken away, and then it was, so he sued, and his argument was that as a Brahmin, he's actually white, and he lost because you couldn't naturalize as a non-white person at this time. You can only naturalize if you're white or black at this time. So, and it was a very tragic decision that led to a lot of South Asians losing their citizenship, not just him. So we're going to be doing a series of programs based on, citizenship.
I saw the one comment from the chat that's really very important for us to think about is from Wing Kai To. It says that it is interesting to think about how theater and the Chinatown culture intersect in the pre-war era, whether it's opera or nightclub, they share similar cultural space. And I think this is really a powerful way for us to reconceptualize how we study our individual area, because it is indeed the same cultural space. These people rub shoulder and dine probably in the same restaurant, go to the same grocery. They probably went to the same Chinese schools, right? And to think about how this cultural space really created such a wide range of performance activities is really important, I think.
Right. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add to that. But yes, I think I agree that this is, there's the same space.
There's a question here, say, Aubrey Marks asked, can you review or speak a little bit more about how the Filipino entertainment presented was or wasn't affected in an exclusion era context?
Right. So Filipinos weren't affected by the exclusion laws because it is a US colony. But on the other hand, I think their cultural productions are very much affected by exclusion mentality, right? Because legal means is not, however you identify yourself or however the government identifies you doesn't affect how your neighbor sees you, right? So in that race is always negotiation, right? So just because you're let in because you're from the Philippines does not mean that you're not going to face the same anti-Asian violence that, Chinese and Japanese people would face. So I think in terms of like everyday life, they very much were affected by the thinking behind exclusion, which is that Asians must go. But they were, however, let in because of the legal status of the Philippines. So I hope that helps. I know that's not a full answer to your question. Leanne says they serve different audience. I think that is largely true, but I think the more we look at it, the more we recognize overlaps. That in a lot of contexts, the same people who went to Cantonese opera might be going to the nightclubs. We certainly know that in in Japanese incarceration camps, the people who went to the dances were taking the koto lessons or whatever other lessons. So I think there might be more overlap between the traditional music and the popular music than we traditionally think. I think this is the conclusion that we're coming to the more we look at this material. Are there other comments, thoughts? Okay. Okay. Andrea, do you have anything?
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to Eric and to Nancy for their excellent presentation. Thank you all for being such an engaged audience. It makes my job easy as well. Let's see. You know, we offer a slew of virtual programs, so I realize that many of you are outside of the DC area. We've got a lot of content that you can take part in, even from the comfort of your home from coast to coast. My colleagues tomorrow are hosting a Black Lives Matter book club. It's the first meeting. And so it's kind of open. There's a few of some of the more popular titles will be part of the discussion. So I can include that link in the chat if you are interested in joining. It is tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
And Andrea, I also, let's see. I want to also just put up the link to the documentary that I talked about. So
sure.
let me just put that in the chat. Is that the best way to share it?
Yes.
Okay. There's 3 links. I thought it'd be useful for people who are interested. So this is Vanishing Chinatown, Havana Diva, and then also a book from which I took a lot of the pictures of the wardrobe. That's called Divine Thread. So these are the 3 things if you're interested.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you for being such a wonderful host. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about this and then share all this in a non-academic setting is wonderful too.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you. And then before I go, just to let you know, if you want to look at our other events besides the Black Lives Matter Book Club, we've got author talks and we've got other speakers. So if you would like to take a look at that, the link is there. Again, most of the programs require Zoom registration, but since you're all here, you're all pros at that. And so we welcome anyone from wherever you are. And then for those of you who are in the DC area, we are offering curbside pickup at the library. We're not offering the library is not open to the public, but we do have that. And then for full details about how that works, I'll put the link in the profile there. That's alexlibraryva.org/curbside. And then the link to the programs is with events. So again, thank you all. Thank you to Eric. Thank you to Nancy. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Bye-bye.